The following graph gives information about acid rain. And this graph shows a number of things. According to this graph, photochemical reactions are driven by the sun. You can see from this graph that the acid rain is a broad term that includes any form of precipitation with acidic components, such as sulfuric or nitric acid that fall to the ground from the atmosphere, in wet or dry forms. You can see from this graph that the acid-forming gases and particles have been linked to a variety of impacts, including forest decline, accelerated leaching of metals from rocks and soils, the decay of limestone, marble, and other building materials, and damage to the human respiratory system. In conclusion, this picture is very informative. This picture gives information about climate zones for temperature and humidity. According to the picture, the largest area can be found in the hot dry summer, cold winter in yellow. It is in the middle of Australia. However, the smallest area can be found in the cool temperature in blue. It is in the southeast of Australia. It also mentions information about other areas, including hot humid, warm humid, temperature and so on. In conclusion, different areas in Australia have different climates. The following graph gives information about Australian population density. Data of different areas are displayed on the map. According to this graph, Melbourne and Sydney are the most populated city in Australia. In comparison, the smallest population is in the middle of Australia. You can see from this graph that Queensland will become the third largest populated city in Australia. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The picture gives information about the chemical experiment. As we can see from the picture, on the left hand, there is a bottle with blue liquid in it. Also there is some chemical equipment which allows the students to do the experiment. In the right of the picture, the man is monitoring the chemical experiment. Also, we can notice that the students are wearing protective glasses and there are big windows behind them. In conclusion, the picture shows how a chemical class can be conducted. The following graph gives information about the closed-loop recycling process. It shows how the process is done. The steps include collect and recycle, sort and shred, mold manufacture, and so on. According to this graph, the first step is to collect and recycle. According to this graph, the second step is sort and shred. You can see from this graph that the third step is mold manufacture. You can also see from this graph that the next step is to assemble and ship. The final step is to purchase and use. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about commuting time in different regions in Britain, 2014. The items include London, Yorkshire, South East, North West, and South West. According to this graph, in London, the value of the commuting time is around 107 minutes, which is the highest value. You can see from this graph that the second highest value of the commuting time is in East of England, which is 71. The lowest value of commuting time is in South West, which is around 56. In conclusion, London has the highest value of commuting time. The following graph gives information about daily hits on the promo page. The items include offline, search, and mail. The horizontal axis is the date, ranging from August 6, 2011, to August 12, 2011. According to this graph, on August 6, 2011, the value of offline is around 1500, and that of AdWords is lower, which is around 800. According to this graph, the highest value of search is around 4000, which is on August 11, 2011. According to this graph, the lowest value of mail is around 400, which is on August 12, 2011. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about Earth crust. This is a very beautiful picture, and it shows a number of things. According to this graph, the first layer is the atmosphere. Followed by that, the second layer is the crust. You can see from this graph that the third layer is the mantle. You can also see from this graph that the next layer is the outer core. The final layer is the inner core. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. This picture gives information about % of university and college students who did educational activities by the hour of the day on weekdays from 12 a.m. to 11 p.m. According to the picture, for full-time students in blue, the largest figure can be found at around 12 p.m., which is around 36%, and the smallest figure can be found at around 3 a.m., which is around 0. For part-time students in green, the largest and smallest figure can be found at 10 a.m. and 3 a.m. respectively, which is 20% and 0 respectively. In conclusion, no one is studying at 3 a.m. The following graph gives information about ancient Egypt trading. It shows how the process is done. The steps include import goods and export goods. According to this graph, the first step is to import cedar oil and timber from Lebanon. According to this graph, the second step is to import copper, precious stones and gold from Nubia. You can see from this graph that the third step is to import slaves and animals from Africa. You can also see from this graph that the next step is to import horses, fruit, and honey from other countries. The final step is to export linen, tools, beads and weapons to other countries. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about the annual change in forest area by region. Data of different areas are displayed on the map. The items include net gain, states, and net loss. According to this graph, the largest areas of forest gain in the 1990-2000 year are in Asia. In comparison, the smallest areas of the net gain in 1990-2000 are in Africa. You can see from this graph that the largest areas of net loss in 1990-2000 are in Africa. In conclusion, the area of the net gain in Asia is much larger than that of the net loss. The following graph gives information about the U.S. energy consumption by fuel. The items include coal, natural gas, and petrol and oil. The horizontal axis is the year, ranging from 1980 to 2030. According to this graph, in 1980, the consumption of coal is around 15, and that of natural gas is higher, which is around 20. According to this graph, the highest consumption of coal is around 30, which is in 2030. According to this graph, the lowest value of natural gas is around 15, which is in 1985. In conclusion, the consumption of petrol and oil is higher than coal, from 1980 to 2030. The following graph gives information about stuff in the rubbish bin. This is a very beautiful picture, and it shows a number of things. According to this graph, in the left area, there is a lot of acceptable food scrap including eggshell, fish bone, soiled paper, noodle, plate scraping, vegetable and orange, surrounding a rubbish bin. The color of the bin is gray. You can see from this graph that, in the right area, there is a lot of unacceptable items including disposable lunchbox, diaper, animal waste, plastic container, flower pot. The color of the lunchbox is white. And the color of the flower pot is brownish red. You can see from this graph that, at the background, there is comparison between acceptable and unacceptable items in the rubbish bin. In conclusion, this picture is very informative. The picture gives information about different arm bones. As we can see from the picture, the human has the largest upper arm bone. Following that, birds and bats have the longest lower arm bone and they are almost the similar length. After that the bats have the longest metacarpals, however, the seal limb has the longest fingers. In conclusion, different body structure has different kinds of bones. The following graph gives information about Australia inbound visitors. The items include countries and years. According to this graph, in New Zealand, the value of 2005 is around 1,099. And in Japan, the value of 2005 is around 570, which is lower. You can see from this graph that the highest value in 2006 is around 1,073. You can also see from this graph that the lowest value in 2006 is around 410. In conclusion, 2005 has the highest number of visitors. The following graph gives information of the Iron Age hut. According to this graph, this is a cross-section of an ancient hut, which is triangular in shape. In the middle of the graph, you can see a pillar supporting the sloping rafters. And the roofs are covered by reed thatch. In the hut, you can see ashes and seats below the ground level. On the ground level, you can see the turf wall. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about journeys made in the UK in 2006 according to their purpose. The items include walking, education, shopping, personal business, school run, day trip, sport, entertainment, and commuting. According to this graph, in walking, the value of men and women are around 4%. You can see from this graph that the highest value of women is in shopping, which is 23%, and the highest value of men is in commuting and business, which is 23%. In conclusion, men and women have the lowest value in holiday and day trip, which is around 3%. The following graph gives information about life expectancy. The items include ages, years. And males, the horizontal axis is years, ranging from 1981 to 2005. According to this graph, in 1981, the value of males is around 70, and that of females is higher, which is around 75. According to this graph, the highest value of males is 80, which is in 2005. According to this graph, the value of females is higher than males, from 1981 to 2005. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about mean temperature world map. Data of different areas are displayed on the map. According to this graph, the largest areas of annual mean temperature are located near the equator. In comparison, the smallest areas of annual mean temperature are located in the Arctic and Antarctic. You can see from this graph that the most suitable area for temperature is around 60 degrees north latitude. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about adults versus teens, number of texts on a typical day. The items include none, 1 to 10, 11 to 20, 21 to 50, and 101 plus. You can see from this graph that, in none, the value of adults is around 9%. You can see from this graph that, in none, the value of teens is around 2%, which is lowest. You can see from this graph that, in 1 to 10, the value of adults is around 51%, which is the highest. You can see from this graph that, in 11 to 20, the value of teens is around 11%, which is the second lowest. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following line chart gives information about palm oil production of Indonesia and Malaysia. According to the line chart, we can see the red line of Indonesia rises from the lowest point, about 5 million tons in 1997 and 1998, to the highest point, about 18 million tons in 2007 and 2008. We can also see the blue line of Malaysia rises from the lowest point, about 8.5 million tons in 1997 and 1998, to the highest point, about 16 million tons in 2007 and 2008. And Malaysia is always higher than Indonesia, until 2005 or 2006. After that, Indonesia is higher than Malaysia. In conclusion, this chart is very informative. The following graph gives information about the proportion of pet expenditure in the US. The items include vet care and well-being, food and litter, pet purchase and so on. According to this graph, the proportion of vet care and well-being is around 47%, and that of food and litter is lower, which is around 41%. You can see from this graph that the highest proportion is vet care and well-being, which is around 47%. You can also see from this graph that the lowest proportion is the pet purchase, which is around 2%. In conclusion, vet care and well-being have the highest proportion of pet expenditure in the US. This picture gives information about correct and incorrect postures. It is a very interesting picture, because it shows a number of things. According to the picture, at the left area, there is a man sitting on the chair. He sits very straight and his eyes are looking at the computer screen, and his hands placed naturally on the keyboard. According to the picture, at the right area, the man is sitting on the chair and his back is hunched bent over, and his hands placed too close to the table. In conclusion, this picture is very informative because it gives information about correct and incorrect postures. The graph shows different eclipses. When we look at the left-hand side of the picture, we can see the sun. In the middle of the picture, we can see the moon, which is on the moon's orbit. On the right of the picture, there is the earth, which orbits around the sun. As we can see in the graph, when the sun, moon, and earth parallel each other, we can see the shade of moon called penumbra creating the partial eclipse. We also can see the middle of a shade called umbra, which means that there is a total eclipse. In conclusion, this graph shows the formation of different eclipses.
The graph gives information about the Sweden government budget in 2018. According to this graph, expenditure SEK is 999 billion, which is in a blue bar, followed by revenue SEK of 1043 billion, which is in an orange bar. According to the center of the graph, it shows that surplus is plus 44, which is in a white circle. In addition, there is a white cube in the lower left corner and there is a white 2018 in the upper left corner. According to this graph, the background is dark blue. In conclusion, this graph is about Sweden government budget in 2018 and it's very informative.
The following graph gives information about the proportion of the Eat Well plate. The items include fruit and vegetables, bread and rice, food, drinks and so on. According to this graph, the proportion of fruit and vegetables is around 35%, and that of milk and dairy food is lower, which is around 18%. You can see from this graph that the highest proportion is fruit and vegetables, which is around 35%. You can also see from this graph that the lowest proportion is food and drinks high in fat, sugar, which is around 8%. In conclusion, fruit and vegetables have the highest proportion of the Eat Well plate. The following graph gives information about how a tomato seed can become a tomato plant. It shows how the process is done. The steps include tomato seed, a young plant, a mature plant, a flower, and a fruit. According to this graph, the first step is tomato seed, which is in a tomato fruit cut in half. According to this graph, the second step is to become a young tomato plant, which is green. You can see from this graph that the third step, a mature tomato plant with green leaves rooted in brown soil, followed by a flower as the fourth step. The final step is a red fruit that comes out of the flower, and the cycle will start over. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The following graph gives information about media in UK. The items include internet, TV, newspaper and radio. According to this graph, in internet, the value of 2005 is around 60%, and that of 2003 is lower, which is around 50%. You can see from this graph that the highest value of 2001 is in radio, which is 63%. In conclusion, newspaper has the lowest value in 2005, about 3%. The following graph gives information about water cycle in nature. It shows how the process is done. The steps include evaporation, transportation, precipitation, and surface runoff. According to this graph, the first step is evaporation in the sun, with water forming clouds into the sky from the blue sea. The second step is clouds transportation into the sky above green and gray mountains, followed by the third step of precipitation, in which water forms surface runoffs. The final step is surface runoffs going to the sea. In conclusion, this graph is very informative. The picture describes the wind machine. As can be seen from the graph, the wind machine is rotating counterclockwise, and the rotation uses the power of wind blades. We can also see that the advantage of this wind machine is its no pollution, and the disadvantaged part is its dependence on wind power. In conclusion, the picture shows a vivid description of the wind machine.